Hello and welcome back. In today's episode, we're going to talk about debugging. What's debugging? Well, it's finding and fixing errors in your code. Now, as a beginner programmer, it's normal that you encounter lots of errors and bugs in your code. But even as a sort of quote unquote expert and somebody who's been very experienced, having decades of experience, it's quite common to make mistakes. And that's why it's important to talk about debugging, why it's not a problem to have mistakes, but it's important to have a structure and have a methodology, how to find them and how to fix them. And of course, how to avoid them in the future. So let's talk about the different types of errors first that you might have in your code. There's basically two main types. There's syntax errors and there's logic errors. So what's the difference? Well, a syntax error is when you've made a mistake in the code words and the terminology. You're missing a semicolon, you mistyped a variable name. It's basically just like a typo, right? You're missing something that the computer needs to compile your program or to execute your program. These are errors that are typically very easy to spot and fix because when you're using an IDE, an integrated development environment, which is basically a fancy term of saying you use a computer program to write other computer programs. It's like an editor, like MS Word, right? IDE. And usually these IDEs are very good to show you when you've made a syntax error. They highlight it, they little underline it with a red curvy thing. Like it's basically just a typo. So this is quite easy to fix, and you won't sort of not notice them because the computer, when it creates the program for you, when it executes it, it will tell you, listen, there's a syntax error, I can't continue. On the other hand, logic errors are a little more tricky. These are errors when you're running your code, but it doesn't give you the results that you were expecting. For example, I don't know if you'd calculate the average of a set of numbers, and your code is giving the wrong answer because maybe you didn't really take into account all the numbers, or you somehow had a mistake in the calculation itself. But it's not a syntax error. It's not that sort of there's a typo in there. It's just you were using the wrong algorithm, the wrong mathematical operation, and the result is simply wrong. So how can you find and fix these errors? Well, the most important thing is you need to read through your code carefully. You need to take a look at each line of the code, make sure that it makes sense and that it's actually doing the thing that it's supposed to be doing. One tool that you can use is the console in your development environment. This is basically a place where you can see the output of your code, as well as any error messages. And it's quite common when you're debugging to print a lot of stuff out onto this console. This is not something that the user of your program is supposed to be seeing, but you're using it to sort of give you step-by-step information about what's going on in your program. Something that you can use there as well is to set a breakpoint in your IDE, which is basically a marker on a certain line in your code where you tell the program when it executes, stop there or pause there and let me look at the variable values and let me look inside and continue step by step from there. So setting breakpoints when you are debugging allows you to really go through the program step by step and execute each line separately and see how your program is behaving, basically, whether it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, whether the variables have the right values there. So setting breakpoints and really going step by step, you can step into functions, into methods, into little sub routines that you're using in your code. And this is also quite useful and used quite often when you're debugging. Another helpful strategy is to break down your code into small chunks and then test each part separately. You can even write unit tests, meaning this is code that tests other part of your code and tells you when you're running the unit test whether the stuff, the little small chunk of code that you're testing behaves correctly or not. This will make it easier to identify where the problem is. It's helpful to write clear and descriptive error messages. This will make it easier for you or someone else to understand what's going wrong. So if your program catches an error, maybe it can't write to a file, or it doesn't get the information from a remote URL that you're pulling in from the internet, then it makes sense to really catch the error, as we say, catch the exception. So that's sort of a error handling routine that's built in your program itself, and then check what's going on, and then give out a meaningful error message to the console or even to the user, so that everybody knows what's going on. It's also important to test your code with lots of different input values, different inputs, different scenarios. Don't just use the quote unquote happy path to sort of give the program the input data that it expects anyway. Try to give a string when you're expecting a numeric value. Try to give a floating point value with a decimal separator there. When you're expecting an integer, try to not give any information and not enter any input value. Just hit enter and see if the program still behaves correctly. And finally, it's important to remember that debugging is an iterative process. You may not find and fix the error that's creeping up there on the first try, but you need to keep trying and experimenting. It's like a treasure hunt, right? You're trying to solve the mystery there, solve the puzzle of what's going on, and you can try experimenting with different strategies, different tools, until you pinpointed where the problem is, and then you can find a solution. And how do you find a solution? Well, don't be afraid to ask for help. There's lots of helpful communities like stackoverflow.com, or just ask a mentor if you've got somebody around that you can ask. But get help. There's lots of help available, and you don't have to be afraid to ask. Debugging is an important part of the programming process. So don't be scared. It's a valuable opportunity to improve your coding skills, to deepen your knowledge, to understand what's going on beneath the hood. And next time you encounter an error or a bug in your code, just don't panic. Take a deep breath, use the tools and strategies that we've discussed, and you'll be on your way to find a solution.